For those of you that might be able to hear me outside, we'll be resuming in a couple of minutes. Those of you at the back of the room, if you could gather the people in the lobby into the room. We're running a couple of seconds behind. We need to get back on board.
We could put it there. That's fine. Okay. Here. No, and Jeanette's going to go first. Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Jeanette, where do you want it? Does this block you? Do you want it down here?
That works, as long as people can see me over the computer screen.
Okay, before you start. So for those of you on the web, I understand that there are some problems viewing the slides. I have a web link for you. If you'll go to drinc.ca.gov/DNN, go to the full agenda, and you will be able to view all of the presentations that are being shown today. Once again, drinc.ca.gov/DNN. Go to full agenda, and you'll be able to view the presentations. I understand they're blurry on screen. Okay, so next we'll have impacts to small disadvantaged communities and case studies. Jeanette Pantoya with the California Rural Legal Assistance, and first we'll have Omar Carrillo, policy analyst with Community Water Center.
We'll flip the script there. Hello, Omar Carrillo, Community Water Center. Good morning. Pleasure to see everybody here in this room. My name is Omar Carrillo. I work with Community Water Center. I'm a policy analyst. Community Water Center was founded several years ago now. We work with disadvantaged communities in the Tulare County, in the San Joaquin Valley, throughout the state that are impacted by contaminated drinking water. So we work very, very closely with communities. My capacity is a policy analyst, and as a role, my role is to be here to learn, to work with folks, and to figure out strategies so we can address this very serious issue that's impacting communities. I'll start out by providing a little bit of history and based on the realities in the Tulare County with the communities that we worked with. So because there is a lot of technical information that is provided to you, and it's been actually incredible, I've learned a great deal this morning, we wanted to really work on humanizing this issue and really getting down to describing what it is to live under these under these conditions, and also to describe kind of what the involvement is from communities. So historically, a lot of the communities that are impacted by contaminated drinking water, historically, currently they're communities of color, communities, Latino communities, farm worker communities. I've actually went to a presentation once and somebody said, well, why don't these folks just move? Well, the reason they don't move is because these communities. They have some of the individuals that we work with that are part of this effort to raise awareness have been part of the fabric of their community for 50, 60 years. And in fact, when they first moved, let's say from Mexico or other parts of the world to Tulare County, they weren't allowed to live anywhere else. So therefore, fast forward to the current situation is, you have primarily Latino communities, and also historically, my background's in community investment, community development. A lot of funding that should have gone to infrastructure development, investment, very basic things, not just water infrastructure, bypass these communities. So there was a lot of redlining and disinvestment. So I wanted to put that forward. And with that said, I'm going to fast forward first before I talk about a couple other things. And first talk about some of the realities in the Tulare County. So just we've recently received a lot of information from a report that was described, AB 2222, which really provided a lot of information, statistical information. It actually is a driver for a lot of what's going on right now on the impact, how many communities are impacted by contaminated drinking water. So we're talking about hundreds of communities just in the Tulare County. We're talking about throughout the state. It also kind of provides that 2 million Californians are not served by public water systems and are not regulated. So it kind of also provides a context for some kind of broader issues in California with communities that are impacted by drinking water. But to hone in on San Joaquin. So in San Joaquin and the Tulare County, you have some of the worst kind of issues. You have not just nitrates, but you have, from fertilizers, you have pesticides. A lot of it, we have also a lot of dairies, and so that also impacts the waters. You have low income, primarily immigrant communities, and you have a community that is low income, and the reality of it is that a lot of these communities, at one point, they received their water from wells, so they were groundwater, and over the whole course of their community, over the course of time, their waters became contaminated. So we have, for instance, a community like the community of Munson, which will be highlighted tomorrow, which at one point had good water. So you tapped into the water system. Each individual property owner had an individual well. You tapped into the water. It was very clean. It was good to go. Now all the water is contaminated. We've seen some of the highest levels of contamination that have been recorded. So we're talking about over 100 parts per and MCL, and so we actually currently have a pilot project, Community Water Center, to see if individual POU systems can address that issue at least on an interim basis. Let's see. Actually, I'm going to go back here. Okay, so just to, so I provided kind of the background, kind of the demographic, and some of the issues that kind of broader contextual issues that are impacting our communities. And so now I'll take a step back, and if I could here, wish I had a little pointer here. Am I going the wrong way? All right, here we go. Good. All right, good. So we had talked about, so it's not just nitrates. So just nitrates, arsenic, uranium. So this is just kind of a graph that, it's some information on statistics on. So it's not just nitrates. So when we're talking about the population and also the county percentages for Fresno, Kern, Kings, Tulare, all counties that we work in, this is kind of what we're looking at in terms of information on impacted drinking water. So, high incidences of nitrate, high incidences of arsenic, uranium, and it's huge. It's a very huge number, and it's getting larger. So 2222 report said that, actually the UC Davis report said that the actual the problem right now is going to impact, at least in the study area, it's going to impact up to 80% of the groundwater by 2050. So that's a pretty important number. And also we'll mention that sometimes, you see a higher incidences in terms of population on arsenic. So just to mention that arsenic is also a nitrate issue, because when you impact nitrate, you have to dig deeper, and then you kind of get into an arsenic issue. So there's been times when we've heard, and arsenic is very, very, very bad for you. So those are kind of just like the bigger contaminants that are impacting communities. And I'll move on from here. Okay, and then so here's another graph, kind of just shows once again groundwater contamination. It's not very easy to see, but you can kind of provides you an understanding of kind of where we are, specifically the communities that we deal with. So 15 counties with the most contaminated communities that rely on contaminated drinking water are in the communities that I had just mentioned. So, once again, the focus area where we're working, we've also included in there Madera. Doesn't really matter. But at least it provides some frame of reference. So as you can see, that this issue is not one that just, that it is a state issue, and it impacts a lot of communities throughout the state, but, primarily concentrated in the counties that I just mentioned. How am I doing with time? Okay. I was going to go over just some of the health impacts, but I won't, because a really good job was done in providing that information. But what I will mention is that I was recently on a tour of communities, just it feels like it was this week, but it was last week, and what we're hearing is you can't take a shower with the water, you can't brush your teeth with the water, you can't use the water, my water is worthless. One specific community member was mentioning how she would bathe her grandson, 1-year-old, in the water. They can't do that any longer now that she bathes her grandson in bottled water, because she can't. It irritates the skin, and primarily the issue in this community is nitrate. Okay, so I'm going to actually wrap this up, but I can't wrap this up without mentioning a couple things, just kind of broader level things. We also work on creating solutions to the issues in these communities. Creating solutions is critical. We have an office in Sacramento and also one in the Central Valley. So, some broader things that I'll mention is, we know that there's aging infrastructure. We know there's a lot of needs, but there's been an identified amount of kind of resource that's necessary to kind of start addressing this in a comprehensive way. So, you know, some numbers, $2.5 billion, and then, you know, on an annual basis, there's a need for $100 million and $30 million just in the study areas that we've actually, we have information on. And so it's a lot of resource, but it's very necessary, and it'll get us there. And I'll also mention that there's a water bond coming up. We're really hoping to have some representation in that, and disadvantaged communities have been kind of looked over in the past. So these are areas of opportunity. Better utilizing our resources is critical. Making regional investments, those are all things that we're also involved in, and communities that we work with are also very much involved in. We have to protect our drinking water resources. You know, we can address the issue at the present time, but if we continue, the problem keeps getting worse, and we're not doing a good job in addressing that. I mean, the ball's always moving, and jobs. I'm not going to say that. So with that said, communities throughout the Tulare County, San Joaquin Valley, Central Valley are, you know, really working themselves, and we're here representing them. And we really look for the people in this room who are very interested in this issue to contact us, to reach out to us, and we're really hoping that, you know, together we can come up with some really comprehensive solutions and think of us as a resource. I say that to a lot of folks. So my name is Omar Carrillo, Community Water Center, and I thank you very much for your time.
So Omar did a really good job of highlighting the social context underlying the impacts to these communities. My name is Jeanette Pantoja. I'm a community worker for California Rural Legal Assistant. Traditionally, we're a legal aid office that has a mostly campesino farm worker client community. And so CRLA has developed programmatic work based on widespread issues that we've seen in our communities, and working in the Salinas Valley, drinking water contamination is certainly one of them. So last year we developed a program called the Salinas Valley Safe Drinking Water Project. And I think based on this audience, what I really want to highlight is the issue of scale, because what you'll hear a lot, even from CDPH or kind of your larger technical assistance providers, is a small community is, you know, 3,000 connections or less than 10,000, I think is what I usually hear. But in the Salinas Valley, the largest system that I work with on a regular basis is 70 connections. And that just gets much smaller than that. So as you're developing treatment devices, really think about that scale in terms of the operations and maintenance costs experienced by some of these communities. So my PowerPoint went AWOL, but I'm going to try to do the best I can to kind of give some context of what we do. So I'll talk about a few communities so you get a better sight of the impact. One of the communities that brought up this attention really in the Salinas Valley was the community of San Gerardo, which is about a 250-person farm worker community. And for almost 10 years, they were impacted by nitrates N123 TCP. There were a lot of physical symptoms that were obvious within the community. And, oh, there it is. So, okay, as this slide kind of illustrates the point that I'm talking about in terms of scale, at least in the Salinas Valley, the smaller you go, the more likely you are to see an impact of nitrate. So the trend kind of goes, the scale goes up as you consider fewer and fewer connections. And so, the communities where we work, I jumped the gun and talked about San Gerardo, but I'll start with San Lucas again. So we've been working in this community maybe since October. It has about 300 residents, and they're mostly farm workers. And their drinking water has been contaminated since March 2011. It's kind of fairly recent for a lot of the community water systems that we work with in the Salinas Valley. And they kind of have a special situation there where there's a cleanup and abatement order that's been issued. So they're being supplied interim drinking water by the responsible party. But it just goes to show this community, you can track the impact by the population in the school. The school goes from kindergarten to 8th grade, and before the contamination, they had about 300 students at their school, and over the years, there's been kind of an exodus where there's only 68 students at the school, and the people who are primarily staying in the community are people who have invested considerable money and time and love into the community. They really take leadership positions, and there's like a couple of last names. You know, they're there because that's where their family is. It's 10 or 12 families, pretty much. Oh, and CHISPA, an affordable housing provider, was going to develop low-income housing there, which is really needed, but since the water became contaminated, there's a moratorium on development, so no housing. Springfield Terrace kind of highlights a very specific issue where, you know, the limit is what, 45 milligrams per liter, but this community's drinking water exceeds 300. So if you're thinking of a point of use or point of entry device where the top limit for certification is 120, that just doesn't apply here and it's no longer an option. You're thinking of a new well location for this community. Well, they are in the Salinas Valley, and we have a very specific issue called saltwater intrusion. So where they don't find nitrates, they'll find salt water. And so currently they have interim drinking water through the Prop 84 emergency grant, but it's a farm worker community, so the population fluctuates in the summer, and currently it's like not only is every house occupied, every garage and back room and shed is also occupied. So the people only getting bottled water right now are the people living in the house, but that pretty much leaves the people living in the garages and the other units with not much options. Camp 21, labor camp. So I'm going to speed up since we have time. Alpine Court labor camp, another one with either no interim source, really high contaminants, can't use a point of entry or point of use device because they're above 120. And because they're private systems, they don't qualify for grant funding in most conditions, but the communities are extremely low income. The MHIs for these communities, or medium household incomes, are about in the 20,000. So they can't really absorb the cost of a loan. And San Gerardo is a community that has experienced this, waited for almost a decade, over a decade for funding, and at the end, the cost of their solution was over $6 million, and now residents pay about $125 a month. And it's mostly because of the O&M. And so when you're looking at the scale of the problem in Monterey County, it's really important to note that if you're just looking at the public water systems, the list of affected communities is not going to be that overwhelming, or at least appear to be overwhelming. Monterey County, what I identify as at least my challenge as an outreach and provider is we have 900 state and local small water systems, so all of these have fewer than 15 connections, and to do outreach to every single community that is at risk of nitrate contamination or already has it in this system is extremely overwhelming. We don't have the staff to do it. And it's an increasing problem, so Monterey County does sampling down to the 2 connection system, and what we saw is a 29% increase in the last 2 years. So we're working with the regional water board to map these communities so that we can better access them and identify them and target our outreach. And then even beyond that, there's the whole problem of people on domestic wells. So it's a pretty big problem, and the problem gets more overwhelming as you go down the scale. And you can compare it in terms of what you see in research in a report as acute and chronic health effects, but a lot of these communities without the proper education act on perception. So I'm almost done. And in many cases, you'll have, like example, I have a woman who has lived in her community for 35 years. Her husband gets dialysis treatment 3 times a week, and she's afraid that her husband will get impacted as he showers because he has an open sore from his dialysis. So it's very much on their mind, on their conscious. That's it.
Okay. We started a little bit late and we've ended a little bit late. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, hang on. Bring you a microphone.
So my question is to a combination of Jeanette and Omar and to the regulators. It sounds like when you talk about doing outreach, it sounds like you're the one letting them know they have a problem, or are they being notified under the kind of system that was described to us by Mark's and other presentations earlier today?
So in many cases, I mean, Monterey County is kind of goes above and beyond. They do monitoring to the 2 connection system, so they will get a notification. But you know, literacy is kind of low in some of these communities, and they won't necessarily understand the implications of the notice or what it really means, or they kind of ignore the notice and all they know is, I can't drink my water. Like, that's the message that stays. You can't use your water. The details of it kind of, if they don't have the education to understand it, it just goes over their head.
Do they also?
Yeah,
oh,
you
I'm
do.
sorry.
Right. They receive the notices, and we actually hand those out sometimes. There's notices that actually show "Do not drink your water." That's very relevant. If you're on a private well, though, I mean, or if you're below 15 connections, that's not always the case. So in some instances, organizations like ourselves will go and will provide, not directly, sometimes directly, but coordinate with the resources available to make sure that they know what's in their water.
Do they understand not to boil the water, that doesn't help? It may.
Yeah, I
matter.
haven't run into anybody who's tried to do that, so.
Other questions? Okay, we're running a little bit late, so we'll go to the next presenter, Chad Seidel, I believe. And this is Challenges for Treatment of Nitrates, Ongoing Nitrate Treatment Studies.
Yeah, looks fine. I'll just stand here. So thanks for being here this morning. Thanks for having me be a part of this. I want to not be the one just standing up here and taking the credit for this work, but more acknowledging the other folks that have really been a key part of this. Craig Gorman that works with me, and then Jeannie Darby, who's in the audience here, and Vivian Jensen from University of California at Davis. This represents a very high-level summary of a lot of work that was done over the last 2 to 3 years in trying to combine the current state of knowledge regarding nitrate treatment alternatives. So people that needed information about what to do when they might have a nitrate treatment need, what might their options be, and how do those options compare with one another? How do they provide advantages and or disadvantages as compared to the other options? And so the folks on the program here wanted me to give a high-level overview of those alternatives as we look ahead to the rest of the program today and tomorrow, highlighting some of the advances in those treatment technologies. So I want to give some acknowledgments to all the good work that's going on and point you to some of the associated research that will be discussed here. Give a very high-level view of the issues associated with nitrate occurrence and MCL violations, a little different look at that from what's been previously presented this morning. And then the majority of the conversation that I'll present will be focusing on nitrate management or treatment options and how you might choose to select those. So I want to acknowledge the American Waterworks Association's Technical and Education Council, the Inorganic Contaminants Water Quality and Research Committees, folks including Susan Brownstein at CDPH were involved in funding the first part of this, and then as part of the DPH funding at UC Davis, as well as the work that led into the SBX1 nitrate work, all resulted in this associated research. So these bullet points here guide you to some of the printed materials available, summarizing all these nitrate treatment alternatives, and the program that you got this morning has some selected pages from these materials that highlight how you might choose some of these treatment technologies and what their advantages and disadvantages are. Again, I really want to give substantial acknowledgement to Vivian Jensen, who's pursuing her PhD at UC Davis. She has done a tremendous job in advancing the state of information on this subject, and so her paper of drinking water treatment for nitrate has been accepted in critical reviews in environmental science and technology, and my opinion is that that paper will be referenced in anything talking about nitrate treatment for the next probably 20 years. It's a great reference that pulls together all this information. So, you know, nitrate is found all over the U.S. Obviously, it has impacts associated with agricultural impacts on water and land use. California is not unique in this, but obviously there are some hotspots in terms of the red areas there in California, as evidenced by this USGS reference from late 2006. If you map over top of that the points at which there are USEPA nitrate violations, these just happen to be the points in 2011. By and large, you get nitrate violations in places where there's high uses of nitrate, and it gets into the subsurface and groundwater. No different in California. These are outputs from the groundwater nitrate report that you can get at the UC Davis website. You know, the study areas that were looked at in the Salinas and Tulare basins identified these points where there were MCL violations in 2011, and so these are no different than we just saw earlier this morning. But if you look at these in terms of the concentrations, you can see that there are some substantially high concentrations, as were just referenced in the previous presentation. So the difference between solving a nitrate problem when you're, say, at or 10% higher than the MCL is very different than if you are 2 or 3 times the MCL. And some of the context we tried to bring into the treatment reports that I referenced previously is how do you deal with that? And there's a table that describes some of the options there, and that's important context to understand if you're thinking about what solutions might be viable for dealing with those problems. Again, trying to give a little bit of context. So Vivian Jensen put together a great poster at the Inorganic Contaminants workshop that was here in Sacramento in January. And here's the national picture, looking at, these happen to be nitrate violation data from 2011, 12, or 2010, 11, and 12. If I use the pointer here, on the left you can see total in 2012 there were 539 systems with violations, total system populations. This isn't necessarily a population exposed, it's just the population served by those systems of just over 230,000 people. California is tops on the list in terms of the number of systems in violation in 2012. They kind of go back and forth of being in the top position or trading with others. For example, like Texas has certainly a lot of violations as well. But more important here is to understand the system size. So these two graphs here on the left is the number of water systems, and you'll note that this graph is cut off here. It goes from 80 to 470 here. This is very much a small system challenge. Small systems are typically located in places where they don't have the wherewithal to put wells further away from the nitrate contamination that they might be experiencing locally, and so they are oftentimes stuck with localized water quality challenges that need to be addressed. In terms of population served, they don't necessarily serve the greatest proportion of the overall population, but they still represent a very large fraction of those that are impacted. Now, if we look in California, again, Vivian did a great job of breaking down the data from the state of California, specifically in that same time frame of 2010 to 2012. And here you see yellow dots representing systems that had a violation 1 year, orange dots for systems that had a violation 2 out of those 3 years, and then the red dots for those that had violations all 3 years. And you know, there are some places where you might get a violation once and then it'll go away. It's either resolved or perhaps there's a groundwater, the way that the groundwater is used that changes if they have a continuous versus or a sporadic violation. But again, if you look at these pie charts on the right, The dark blue here, which is the predominant portion here in all of these cases, is very, very small systems. So again, this is a system challenge for those that are serving very few service connections. And that's important to keep in mind as we think about the treatment technologies. Here are those numbers in terms of California violations from 2010 to 12. And you'll note that, you know, these numbers in the small systems serving a population of fewer than 500 have been increasing over that time period of 2010 to 12. The rest of these systems are, you know, more sporadic system violations where there might have been a single well that had a problem and that management issue has been resolved since then. So let's keep our focus on these systems where we're serving fewer than 500 people, and as referenced previously, oftentimes they're serving maybe 70 as a total or even fewer. So this family tree, so to speak, of nitrate treatment technologies is in your handout, so you can always refer back to this. Broadly speaking, there are only so many ways that you can deal with nitrate in your source water. One, you can avoid treatment altogether, and if this is possible, it certainly is the most recommended solution. And so we've got options there on the top part of the tree of non-treatment, including abandoning the well, which obviously doesn't work if you don't have another supply, dealing with ways to mitigate the input of that contaminant, nitrate in this case, of using wellhead protection and land use management changes. There is research and literature that suggests how that can work, not only here in the United States, but elsewhere in other countries around the globe. Finding alternative sources and source modification, this certainly falls under that category of regionalization. If you can get communities to band together and use higher quality sources, that obviously is preferred. Some states in the US have been much more successful at implementing that approach than others. There are some substantial geographical challenges in the state of California to overcoming that issue. And there's just the flat reality that there's only so much water in the state here, and we are using the vast majority of that water supply that we can for public water supply purposes. And so there aren't too many other options to go to, so we need to do the best use of what we've got. Now, blending is always a key part of managing nitrate contamination. There are a lot of systems in the state of California that are using blending to comply with the current MCL, and we certainly anticipate that will be a key aspect moving forward because it's clearly a lower cost solution to addressing that water quality challenge. Now then, let's talk about, as I move past the non-treatment options, I wanted to just jump ahead to the treatment options here on nitrate removal. When you get to treatment options, you can deal with nitrate one of two ways. You can actually physically remove it, which is similar to other, elemental contaminants. We've talked a little bit about arsenic this morning. Arsenic, if you remove it from water, it's going to be removed into whatever you're transferring it to. You can't reduce it like nitrate has some chemical reduction pathways where you can actually transform it to nitrogen gas and then have it just be released to the atmosphere. So on the nitrate removal side, there's really three primary treatment technology classes. You've got ion exchange and all the variations below that, and I'll talk a little bit about those. Reverse osmosis or high pressure membrane systems, which are driving water through a membrane and by doing so retaining contaminants and salts and other things on the upside of the membrane. And then electrodialysis, which is not used that much. Certainly in the US, it's used a little bit more abroad, but can be used for nitrate removal, and there are some advances in that technology as well. This approach for these removal technologies, again, removes the nitrate and puts it in some other process stream. And so the challenge for each one of these things, as you'll note for the ion exchange, reverse osmosis, and electrodialysis bullet points there, you'll note that the limitations of each one of these is that there is some sort of disposal challenge, and the next speaker will address some of those challenges. How do you deal with the resulting residual streams? Again, this is no different than treatment technologies for elemental contaminants like arsenic or chromium, those things where you're removing those contaminants into another residual stream. Then you have to deal with that residual stream and manage it appropriately. So ion exchange has been used in potable drinking water for decades, has a good history of being applied, certainly at larger water utilities. You use a ion exchange resin, an anion exchange resin that's usually regenerated in a chloride form, and so you use a strong salt solution of sodium chloride to basically regenerate that resin to displace all the contaminants that are on that and make it a fresh resin again to remove contaminants again. It loads up with those contaminants over time, and then you regenerate it over and over again. We'll talk more specifically about that technology tomorrow with several presentations about different adaptations of that approach. But that resin regeneration with the brine solution can be problematic, particularly in those parts of California that are the most challenged, as we showed on the maps before, because they're dealing with other salt balance challenges in those parts of those water basins. The last thing we really want to be doing is loading more salts into those basins. Those may not be feasible options, which is why the vast majority of ion exchange treatment plants for nitrate removal in California are trucking their residual brine after its useful life to disposal locations along the coast where disposing of it in that way is not problematic, and the salt is not a problem out in the ocean. Other key limitations in terms of treatment performance are sulfate and other competing anions. If sulfate concentrations are high, the resin is not as effective at removing nitrate, and so that means you have to regenerate more frequently, takes more time, costs more money because you're buying more salt, using more power, trucking brine more often. Resins can foul in some water quality conditions, and again, you always have to deal with brine disposal. Now, reverse osmosis is another technology that you might be familiar with these, even if you have a small under sink water treatment system at your house for a point of use device. But this is where water is pushed through a tight membrane. So the membranes are so tight in terms of the pore sizes that contaminants like nitrate and arsenic and other things are rejected by the membrane, but the water itself is allowed to pass through. The limitations here is that those membranes can foul over time by rejecting all of the nitrate and other contaminants. They're also rejecting other things like the salt that might be in that water to begin with. And some of those salts can build up to the point at which that they complex with other things in the water, and they will permanently foul the membrane surface with either organic or inorganic fouling that renders those membranes less effective. So for those of us that are engineers that deal with those treatment solutions, that's what we do all the time. However, if you want to implement this system at a location where there's one person that's responsible for maintaining public works facilities, water treatment facilities, a wastewater facility, the swing sets, those folks may not have the time or the expertise to deal with the operational aspects of a treatment technology such as this. Now, reverse osmosis also has some pre-treatment needs. Sometimes that's chemical addition, sometimes that's pre-screening, depending upon the water quality coming from the well. And then, again, you have a brine disposal. For context, well-designed and operated ion exchange systems typically can achieve brine disposal rates of certainly 1% or less, and in some cases 0.1% of the total water flow or less. And you'll hear more details about that, I suspect, in the presentations about those technologies tomorrow. And so if you have, 1,000 gallon per minute well, or more appropriately for small systems here, maybe a 10 gallon per minute well, 1% or 0.1% of that would need to be disposed of and trucked away for ion exchange. Reverse osmosis, particularly at smaller flow sizes, are not as aggressively designed as you might for a very large treatment system. And so because of that, the water recoveries that you get from a reverse osmosis system are not as high as you would achieve for those more aggressively designed systems. So you might have only 85% water efficiency. So 15 to 20% of the water that is treated has to be disposed of. And we'll hear more about that in some of the specific presentations tomorrow as well. Now, electrodialysis is sometimes confused with high-pressure membrane processes because electrodialysis and electrodialysis reversal do use membranes in the treatment process, but they combine membranes with an electrical potential to draw the contaminants away from the water flow that's going through an electrodialysis cell. So the water that you drink, or it comes out of the end of the treatment process, has not gone through a membrane. Rather, the contaminants have been drawn through those membranes to the other side of them for the residuals disposal streams. These can be simple to operate in some cases, but oftentimes they're challenged by some of the issues associated with membrane processes, coupled with the challenges of ion exchange or cation exchange things, because you're really putting those two components together. Now you've got membranes with anion and cation exchange properties that are managed in a continuous process. So there are some operational complexities with those. I think the challenge for water treatment technology providers is to simplify those things to make them relevant for small system scales. Rather than having a brine for disposal, electrodialysis or electrodialysis reversal or selective electrodialysis, like we'll hear about tomorrow, they don't necessarily produce what we would consider a brine waste. They produce what we would call more of a concentrate for disposal. So they're more selective in terms of removing nitrate and chloride, but they don't reject absolutely everything like a high pressure membrane would do. So that's the very brief family tree of nitrate removal technologies. Now let's move to nitrate reduction, either accomplished with biological systems or with chemical systems. And this is an approach that simply intends to transform the nitrate via reduction pathways all the way to nitrogen gas, which is unique in terms of a drinking water treatment process. There aren't that many other drinking water treatment chemical, or contaminants rather, where we have treatment options that allow us to effectively destroy them to a state where we don't have to deal with them in a residual stream. So there'll be a whole afternoon talking about biological denitrification this afternoon, where you're using bacteria to transform nitrate to nitrogen gas using anoxic conditions, and you've got to supply an electron donor. We'll hear examples of both heterotrophic and autotrophic systems where you use either organic or inorganic electron donors. And as I'm saying these things and we're talking about small system implementation, you're probably getting the sense of, yeah, these are some a little bit more complicated systems. They have a few more unit processes to operate them, and those therefore need to be controlled and managed to provide consistent, high quality water, achieving our treatment objectives. Now, these slides we put together, in fact, I think we presented these for a national webcast just last summer, and we had the point here of the lack of U.S. full-scale systems. But what you'll hear this afternoon is there is a growing base of full-scale system application right here in California. California water systems and technology providers have been leading the charge in demonstrating biological treatment of nitrate for the last several years. There have been limited examples of these systems in a couple other states in the U.S., but California is certainly recognized as leading the charge for this treatment technology. That said, all of those demonstrations to date have focused on much larger scale treatment systems. There are certainly economies of scale with biological treatment systems. There's some operational simplicities that come with operating a larger system. You can operate it without stopping. You can manage one well off, one well on, and combining those water supplies. So again, we need to kind of take those solutions, turn it on end, and put it through the small system machine to figure out what's the best way to apply that for small water utility systems. You have to supply a substrate here. You have to provide an electron donor, so you're either adding, an acetic acid, or there's other examples that will be presented this afternoon. Sometimes you can use hydrogen as an inorganic donor. Those are chemical supplies that would need to deliver to those treatment systems on an ongoing basis, and so we want to compare those approaches with other technologies that might be offered as well. And then post-treatment, we're using a biological treatment process to reduce nitrate to nitrogen gas. The biological community itself produces those communities intentionally die off over time, and so you have to filter those out and disinfect the water, which really speaks to the multiple unit processes needed in these treatment systems. Now let's shift to chemical denitrification. We're not going to talk much about this at all in the treatment aspects of the program for this afternoon or tomorrow, and that is because while chemical denitrification has shown certainly great promise in helping address nitrate treatment challenges, and it has been researched for years, in fact, I've been a part of researching that for years, its simplicity is very, very appealing in that you've got a chemical media that might reduce nitrate to nitrogen gas is typically what you want to have happen. Research is often more times showing that it's not reducing it all the way to nitrogen gas, and rather it's only reducing it to ammonia, which then can cause other challenges with respect to disinfection efficiencies in the distribution system when combining with chlorine. Typically we're talking about using something like a zero valent iron. This technology, if you would, is often used in subsurface remediation approaches where there's really, really high nitrate contamination. They'll put a permeable barrier or a wall in that allows nitrate contaminated water to be reduced in the subsurface. There's also catalytic denitrification that is emerging, and late tomorrow afternoon I'll give some examples, some of those technologies that are trying to break free from the academic realm where people have made these things work at a bench top. Most of these things are not in the US, they're in other locations throughout the world where they're trying to address these conditions. But that's what we need to do, to forge ahead in finding treatment solutions that might avoid treatment residual challenges and the issues associated with chemical supplies or operator complexity. We need to continue to push the envelope in investing in new technology developments there. So we also have a slide on point of use and point of entry, and it is certainly important to note that these treatment options are important to consider. California has an approach that these can be used as interim solutions for MCL compliance. Other states in the US have approaches that allow that for permanent installation and compliance. That said, while they might be the most appropriate and cost effective, they are not without challenges. They require routine connections with the water system customers to go and maintain them and ensure that they're working properly. You know, the emerging research in this area is, can we put sensors on those things that will allow us to discern if they're working well without having to go into people's homes? For context, one of the systems that I've worked on that uses point of use devices for MCL compliance, not for nitrate, but for another contaminant, it was for a community water system that actually only has 7 active connections. It was a community that was intended to develop to a pretty large community, and the economic downturn of about 5 years ago pretty much stopped that. And so now, as an interim solution, they're using point of use devices, and even for those 7 households where they have to maintain those systems, it is a challenge for the very large public water supplier that's managing this small system to stay on top of that. So investing in treatment technology advances here may not be what's needed most. More, we need to invest in the administrative and the managerial capacity necessary to manage these types of systems, particularly for small communities that could benefit most from those. So again, in the handouts, Eugene did a good job in taking some of the materials that came out of the groundwater nitrate report. You can get the full report at the UC Davis website. I'm not going to speak to this stoplight chart that much, other than to say, if you look at the different treatment options, we're moving left to right: ion exchange, RO, electrodialysis or reversal, biological denitrification or chemical denitrification, and then go top to bottom for the issues that these things will address. You know, nitrate removal, dealing with TDS, arsenic, radium and uranium, chromium, certainly on the minds of a lot of people these days, perchlorate, dealing with hardness, what are the issues in terms of reliability, how much training or operational complexity do they have, what are the costs in terms of capital and O&M costs, their footprint constraints, what's our experience as a water community in dealing with these things, and then what's the ease of dealing with the waste. Now, to try to simplify all those issues for these treatment technologies on one graph is not a simple task, and I could argue with myself over what we assigned for each one of these boxes for many of the nuances for these things. But what this tells you is that Note that there is no single technology going top to bottom that has green lights all the way across. And there's a lot of variability across each one of those primary issues or concerns for treatment when you're thinking about nitrate treatment. And so oftentimes my involvement and my colleagues' involvement within the water community in addressing nitrate treatment challenges has been on the heels of a community spending, you just insert X number of years and Y millions of dollars to solve a nitrate challenge. And they went down one of these roads thinking, hey, this is the best thing, thinking about only one or two of these issues of concern, only to find out later that, oh, we didn't really think about this other issue of concern later on. And so as much as innovating and bringing new technologies to the table is important, I think we as a broader community all have to be invested in making sure that we're making good engineering decisions, kind of public policy decisions, and investment decisions about what technologies and what implementation approaches we should move forward, because a very broadly based assessment is needed for sorting out what these approaches can do for these systems. So there's also this table in the handout that talks about what these options are, gives you some high-level views of the considerations that you need to think about. I think I've spoken to most of those already. You can certainly refer to this through the presentations that are made in the rest of today and tomorrow. And I want to give some context for what these treatment technologies, where they've been installed to date. So here you've got different colored circles for biological denitrification, ion exchange, reverse osmosis, combined systems with biological denitrification and reverse osmosis, or ion exchange and reverse osmosis, and then blending. And there are systems throughout the state of California operating with all of these treatment approaches. You'll note that there's no chemical denitrification circles on there. None of those are implemented at full scale, haven't, and there are going to be probably more years of research and application before that happens. But it's also important to look at where these are located. I think if you look at the proportion of the systems installed here up in the top, almost 70% of those nitrate systems that are installed to date are ion exchange systems, followed by reverse osmosis, and then you've got the smaller proportions of the biological denitrification systems and then the combinations thereof. So even in these existing installations that are using those primary treatment technologies of ion exchange and RO, as you'll hear in the presentations later today and tomorrow, there's probably opportunities for those technologies to be even further optimized and further advanced to lower the operational cost, minimize the residuals disposal challenges, and really serve as kind of test beds to advance those technologies to make them more applicable for smaller communities. And I think we need to leverage those installations that are already installed to drive that technical innovation further. In the actual subbasins that are of interest for the report there, you see those systems here. A lot of blending in the Central Valley. You can get away with that if your nitrate concentrations aren't too high above the MCL, and you've got some other water supplies that can be blended down. Here's some details about the concentrations. You'll note that there isn't a big distinction between the concentrations here, other than the systems that are employing blending have average nitrate concentrations that are actually less than the MCL, which is why they're in place now. They're kind of protective measures in many of those cases. So I think I'm about done here. In conclusion, ion exchange and reverse osmosis still dominate the current installations. There's a lot of interest and investment in newer technologies, the advancements with biological denitrification, advances in the electrodialysis realm, and then really advances in the improvements to these two treatment technologies. If we can minimize or resolve the challenges associated with brine management for these two technologies in particular, we could make them much more feasible for places where we've just presumed they're not feasible to date. So electrodialysis or reversal is implemented, but usually not just for nitrate. Usually it's been for nitrate plus some sort of high salt challenges, TDS concerns. The selective electrodialysis approach, which is been moved ahead in other countries, has been tested at small scale here in the U.S., may offer a more efficient option, and we'll hear a little bit about that tomorrow. I'm really looking forward to the conversation this afternoon to hear the providers of different biological denitrification systems, to hear the context of their full-scale applications here in the state and how that is expected to continue to advance and mature, see how we can apply those things for smaller systems. And then there is still that glimmer of hope that chemical denitrification approaches might actually come to reality, and if those were to move ahead, it could solve some of those brine management and residuals management challenges. But it's still kind of off on that mirage distance, ever in front of us, but always thinking that we could maybe get there someday. So with that, I'll leave you with the black screen and answer some questions, and thanks for being a part of this dialogue today and tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Chad. I've been asked by folks on the web to repeat where we can find the presentations. They are found at drinc.ca.gov/DNN. Go to full agenda and you should be able to see all of the presentations from today and tomorrow. Yes, sir, hang on, I'll bring you a microphone. I don't have a lot of time, we're running a little bit short, so I'm gonna
Just a quick, I don't know, it's a question or a comment, but in the EDR that you were talking about, one thing that I did not hear about is the fact that it really works with polar materials. So to the extent that there are pesticides, other hydrophobic materials, you're actually guaranteeing that this will remain in the product water.